Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another nonfiction review. The fact that this review happens to be going out during Pride Month, well, it will seem like deliberate timing on my part, but it wouldn't be right for me to take credit for paying attention, because my biggest fault, and anyone who's watched my BookTube newbie tag video will know I've admitted to this, my biggest fault is not paying attention, or at least not paying attention until it's too late. I did not select the book we are reviewing today to coincide with Pride Month. The honest truth is that I was looking for a shorter work of nonfiction. I was literally opening and closing every book in my Kindle library, with the priority being find a nonfiction title that's less than 300 pages. And that was done with the hope that I could finish 5 books during May instead of my usual 4. And I did finish 5, so that's cool. But if you are looking for something to read during Pride Month, this title will be a great choice. I thought I knew something about queer history in the UK, but it turns out I was just flattering myself. The book we'll look at today is Queer City, Gay London from the Romans to the Present Day, written by Peter Ackroyd and published in 2017 by Chatto and Windus. Can I summarize this book? Well, the title does a pretty good job, actually, of summarizing itself. This book is a survey. It's going to sweep across several centuries, skimming off what London records and published works can tell us about queer expression in the city. For most readers, it will be eye-opening, because the history of gay London stretches back 2,000 years, and also because there were odd times, like the mid-18th century, when certain open expression of queerness seems to have been better tolerated than it was, say, by comparison, with the mid-20th century. But better tolerated is not saying much, because most of what we know about gay men and women in London comes from court records and police records. In other words, these are queer people defending themselves against charges for which the penalties varied, but for provable sexual activity between men, up until 1861, the death sentence could be applied. So this questionable tolerance of the 18th century was followed by a record-breaking number of arrests and executions in the early 19th century. For example, 80 queer men were hanged in London between 1806 and 1835. That's about 3 per year. So what do we know about the author? Peter Ackroyd was born in 1949 in London, growing up in East Acton. He attended Clare College, Cambridge, where he got a double first in English literature. In 1972, he was awarded a residential fellowship at Yale University, and that provided the time and the resources so he could research his first book, Notes for a New Culture, which was published in 1976. Since then, he has worked as editor for The Spectator. He's also been a regular book reviewer for the Times newspaper. He's a published poet, published novelist, but I think in the last 20 years, he has become well known for his nonfiction works which deal with aspects of English or London history or the biographies of famous Londoners. Because his writing is so diverse, his list of awards is diverse, and talking through them, well, really, that would just be a very underhanded way for me to pad out this review. So I'm just going to link to the list on Wikipedia. He's also presented a number of programs for the BBC dealing mainly with London, which is where you will be not much surprised to know he is currently living. Let's talk about how the book is structured. There are 18 chapters. They average 13 pages each. The first 5 chapters present what is known about the lives of gay men in London from the Roman occupation until the Tudors, and teaches you the terminology used at the time to label them, because that vocabulary was very different and you'd need to know it in order to recognize references to queerness in old public records. Chapters 6 to 10 cover the 16th and 17th centuries. Chapters 11 to 15, the 18th century, which is where we get the earliest mentions of female same-sex attraction. Chapters 16 to 18 cover the 19th and the 20th century. Now, I can get how you might have imagined that Ackroyd would surely have more material to work with the closer he got to our time. And yes, he probably does. But because this is a survey, he's not trying to do a deep dive where there is more detail. And anyway, Ackroyd's bibliography is full of suggestions for more in-depth reading. Let's talk about how I got this book. I bought the Kindle version on the 29th of October last year. It was one of those books that you buy in a hoarding mode, right? When you know that a book buying ban is imminent. That was the last 3 days that I could buy books. Now, at the time, I was also reading a biography of Gore Vidal, which mentions Ackroyd once, and a memoir by Reverend Richard Coles, which was about his grieving after the loss of his husband David. So either of those books might have got me wondering if there existed any kind of history of gay life in the UK. Also, I already owned the Kindle version of Peter Ackroyd's History of England, titled Foundation. Now, I bought that back in 2014, and I haven't read it yet. Maybe I should have read it first, but never mind. It was probably too long. The Kindle version of Queer City is 262 pages long. 231 of those are the text. Then there's 45 pages of illustrations at the back, 9 pages of bibliography, and 17 pages of subject index. But more specifically, I may have chosen Ackroyd's book because I have been interested in queer London during Shakespeare's time. Maybe I hoped it would shed light on his plays, and yeah, Ackroyd did zoom in on 16th century theatre life, quoted lines from various playwrights, including Shakespeare. And yeah, I felt there was ample evidence of a culture that used theatre as a gathering place and a limited means of self-expression. I'm going to read a passage from page 48 in the book. The great London playhouses, including the theatre and the Curtain, were little better than pick-up joints for queer men. The acting companies were therefore schools for scandal. In Ben Jonson's Poetaster, 1601, Ovid learns that his son is to become an actor. What? Shall I have my son on the stage now, he says, an ingle for players. Ingle was a medieval term for a young man who sought out or was sought by other men. I'll carry on reading. Some male members of the audiences came especially to watch a favourite boy, perhaps in a woman's part. The playwright Thomas Dekker invites the gallants in the audience to pay a little more in order to come upon the stage where, quote, you may, with small cost, purchase the dear acquaintance of the boys. The evidence suggests that there was a large conclave of queers who knew each other, if only by sight, and used the theatres as their meeting places. From the evidence of the plays themselves, they shared jokes and puns and risky allusions. It might be going too far to suggest that they were a community in any accepted sense of the word, but they were a strong and recognizable presence in the public spaces of London. Two of their favourite haunts, the theatres of Whitefriars and Blackfriars, specialized in boy actors, or, as Middleton put it, quote, a nest of boys able to ravish a man. Whitefriars in particular specialized in homoerotic plays which dealt in vulgarities and obscenities. A dedicated audience no doubt enjoyed the pun and the fun. The humor itself was broad and bawdy. My office is Italianated, one character in The Turk explains. I am fain to come behind. References abound to bums, pricks, erections, dildos, inches and bits, amorous Jew, and quick flesh. Have I encountered anything unexpected or particularly interesting? The mid-18th century in London seemed to be a time of unusual tolerance for queer expression. I won't be more optimistic than that, because there was a hard social line. It separated the wealthy man who wished to take male lovers or wear women's clothing, and the poor man who wanted to do the same thing. Sexuality and class intersected in such a way that it created an association of wealth and privilege and abuse of power with homosexuality. And so what I realized from Ackroyd's history is that working class homophobia in the 19th and 20th centuries may contain a strong element of class hatred also. And it also surprised me the number of London marriage records that Ackroyd found where both partners were later discovered to be women. That is, one woman impersonated a man and took a false name for the ceremony, and then carried on dressing and acting like a man in order to keep up the appearance. And this would have been tricky in the mid-19th century, when in England, men who did not grow facial hair were regarded with some suspicion about their masculinity. Is there anything readers should be prepared for if they're going to read Queer City? Well, be prepared for some explicit writing, like the passage I just read aloud about London theatres. Ackroyd does not go out of his way to be explicit, and most of the historical record is adverse to being clear about same-sex attraction. It presumes that keeping the subject concealed would reduce the numbers of participants. And this prudishness, it can be a source of amusement. I'm going to quote here from page 217. It was in the context of quiet and not so quiet persecution that the Wolfenden Committee was established in 1954 to inquire into the legal status of homosexual acts. The committee comprised the great and the good, but they were neither conventionally liberal nor unprudish in their social attitudes. For the sake of the ladies present at the proceedings, homosexuals were known as Huntleys and prostitutes as Palmers, after a well-known firm of biscuit makers. But the poets and playwrights and diarists and the letter writers that Ackroyd quotes, they're less restrained in their language. Also, a considerable amount of same-sex activity among men was happening between adults and minors, and consent was only something you needed to obtain if you were the less powerful person. There's also descriptions of the ways in which some men and women were convicted for having gay sex or running a brothel for gay men, and, in particular, descriptions of the pillory, or stocks as they were called, where the accused would be immobilized and placed on a pedestal in a public space. It was not uncommon for prisoners to die from injuries sustained from the abuse of strangers. Another interesting thing about the book is that the history of female same-sex attraction, there's fewer records from which to draw. Ackroyd speculates that maybe there was just less social concern, or female gay relationships were more difficult to detect because there was this greater acceptance of affectionate female friendships and affectionate female behavior. The book makes as much as can be made from the evidence while keeping to its remit of being a survey. But if you were interested in queer history, but you in particular wanted more detail about lesbian or trans lives, for which there is also very limited data, then you might want to check out the further reading recommendations I'm going to make. Well, the first book I'm going to recommend comes from Ackroyd's bibliography in the back, and it is A Lesbian History of Britain, Love and Sex Between Women Since 1500. That was published in 2007, and the author is Rebecca Jennings. And the second book comes from one of my own online searches, which is Out of the Ordinary by Michael Dillon. Now, Dillon was the earliest known UK trans man to undergo transition surgery, and perhaps the first trans man to be ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk. This one's on my wish list, and my wish list is growing again, by the way. I seem to be having really restless time at the moment, as if the end of my Read What You Own challenge seems like years away. But so far, we're hanging in there. And that's another review done. But there's more on the way. There's always more on the way. I'm working on another Middlemarch meditation, and I've also finished a Ruth Rendell novel, her debut novel, would you believe? And if it hadn't been a mystery involving her famous fictional detective, Inspector Wexford, I would not have guessed that it was written by Rendell. But more on that later. By the time you see this, I will be back from holiday, probably doing the laundry or grocery shopping to restock the fridge, that kind of thing, but also reading. And I hope your reading is going really well so far this month. Look forward to seeing you guys all again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.